Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly LinkedIn Live session here, where we at Fuqua broadcast on LinkedIn talking about the research that faculty are conducting here at Fuqua. So today in my talk, my name is Angelica Leigh. I'm a professor in the management and organizations area here at Fuqua. And today I'm going to talk to you about a couple different research projects that are aimed at uncovering the effects of race in the workplace. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. But as questions come up for you, feel free to put them in the chat. We have someone monitoring the chat, and they will send it my way, and I will either answer those questions as I am presenting, or I will answer them at the end. As I mentioned, the agenda for today, talking about the effects of race in the workplace, I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about the background of this research and this research topic and why I think it's so important. And then I'm going to give you a summary of findings from 3 different research projects that are aimed at really uncovering the effects of some of the effects of race in organizations. The first being the effects that megathreat events that happen in society have on racial minority employees when they enter the workplace. The second being looking at the perceptions of racial minority leaders as they're engaging in allyship behaviors that are aimed at advancing racial justice in organizations. And the last project is a ongoing research project that actually hasn't been published yet, where I am working with a PhD student here at Fuqua and another colleague at UNC, where we're looking at leaders' use of racism-elusive language when discussing or addressing issues of race. So a little bit of background on this topic. Race impacts nearly every facet of our lives. So, whether that is the neighborhoods in which people live in, where the US is just as, or if not even more segregated today than it was 50 years ago, which also impacts educational access, health outcomes. So, we know that Hispanic, Native American, and Black patients often suffer from worse healthcare outcomes than white people in this country, and your position in the labor market. So, Black workers, for example, make up about 13% of the US population and the US workforce, but there are lots of roles in which Black workers make up 25% or more of the workforce. And this graphic shows that these tend to be occupations that are more service oriented. And so also roles in which the pay is less and the job security is less as well. And a recent survey that was done by the Pew Research Center found that Black workers report more than any other racial group that being Black or being a member of their racial group makes it a lot harder for them to be successful at work. And so race impacts a lot of different aspects of our lives, including experiences in the workplace. Yet, the effects of race in organizations are often ignored. When people first think about a workplace, they tend to think about the employees and the structures that are in that workplace, the organizational practices that are present. But we tend to not think about the ways that race impacts those different facets of organizations. And research also has tended to take a race neutral approach, where when you think about employee productivity or organizational culture or structures, research tends to ignore the influence that race has on those different aspects of organizations. And there are seminal theories that have been published that really highlights the way that both practitioners and researchers tend to ignore the influence of race in organizations. And I'll just talk about 2 of the ways in which race is actually a fundamental aspect of organizations. So the first is that we know, in research that has been done by both organizational scholars and scholars in other academic disciplines, has actually demonstrated that a lot of the modern day management practices that are common in organizations today. Take, for instance, a practice where employees are assigned a specific task and then they need to finish that task by the end of the day. Those processes were actually developed on slave plantations in the American South. One other way to kind of communicate race as being a fundamental aspect of organizations, we know that race influences access to different levels in organizational hierarchies, where Black and Hispanic or Latinx workers tend to be disproportionately represented in lower level positions, meaning that it's more common in a US corporation today to find a large number of Black and Hispanic workers that are janitors or work in the cafeteria in those organizations than it is to find that same number of workers that are members of those racial groups in the executive or C suite of those organizations. And so, what I do in my research is I try to really just focus in on this idea that race is fundamental in organizations. And I try to work on research that really uncovers some of the ways that race influences people's experiences at work. And so, in one line of research, I look at the experiences of racial minority employees, the unique experiences that are tied to race for employees that work in organizations. And then in another line of research, I look at the behaviors that employees engage in when they're attempting to advance racial equity or an equity more generally in organizations. And today I'm going to try and to fit in talking about three different research projects that are in these two streams of research for me. So the first research project that I'm going to talk to you about is some of my early work that looks at the influence that mega threat events have on racial minority employees' avoidant work behaviors. And to begin, I always like to tell the personal story for how I came to study this research topic. And this research really started after an experience that I had after seeing videos of two Black men being killed by police posted on social media. The first was of Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, outside of a gas station. And the second was of Philando Castile, who was killed during a traffic stop with his daughter or with his girlfriend and her daughter in the car. And I watched these two police shootings back to back on social media. They occurred within 48 hours of each other. And I remember after watching these videos being extremely distraught. And I found myself no longer being able to invest in the work tasks and the research that I was doing as a grad student that I had found so interesting the day before. And I was really consumed by these negative emotions and this experience of threat, and it distracted me from my work tasks. And since I had that experience, I've really been trying to empirically understand whether this is a more widespread experience and whether employees, not just myself, are actually having unique experiences in the wake of these highly publicized negative societal events. So my collaborator in this work, Shimul Melwani, and I developed the term megathreats to refer to these events. And these events are defined as large-scale negative identity-related episodes that receive significant media attention. And as we've been conducting this research, we've looked at the effects of multiple different megathreats that impact different identity groups. But in this talk, I'll focus on two studies, which looks at the influence of these events on employees in the workplace. The first was a study that we conducted with Asian employees and white employees in the wake of the Atlanta area spa shootings, where 8 victims were tragically killed. 6 of them were women. And this was a shooting that specifically targeted Asian businesses. And so we wanted to understand the influence that these events had on Asian employees. And we compared those experiences to white employees in the wake of these events. And in our second study, what we did is we looked at the influence of different mega threats. In this case, it was police shootings of Black civilians. And one of those police shootings that was in this event was the tragic killing of George Floyd at the hands of police in the summer of 2020. And in general, what we find is that when employees share identity with mega threat victims, it leads employees to ultimately withdraw from their work tasks and their coworkers in the wake of these mega threat events. But it's really a multi-step process that we uncovered in this research. So first, using this data that we collected from Asian and Black employees, and we compared it to the experiences of white employees in the wake of these events, what we find is that Asian and Black employees in both studies experience heightened embodied threat or just worrying about their own personal safety as a result of the event. So, in addition to being, sad and feeling distraught that these events are even occurring in the world, these employees who shared identity with victims of these events also experience this high level of threat or concern for their own safety. But given that most organizations tend to ignore the influence of race and these negative race based experiences that people have in both society and the workplace, most employees feel as if they have to suppress their threat experience in the wake of these events, which then leads people to avoid their work tasks because this threat suppression process really consumes energy and prevents you from being able to invest in your work tasks in the way you did the day before. Another important finding we had in this research is that we developed this term called identity based psychological safety. Some of you may have heard of psychological safety more generally, but in this paper, we focused on identity based psychological safety, or the implicit belief that it is safe to talk about experiences related to race in the workplace. And what we found is that identity based psychological safety could actually buffer against these negative consequences of megathreat events on employee work behaviors, such that when identity based psychological safety is higher, and on this graph, the minus standard one deviation of discussions being unsafe means that they're more safe, you can see that the relationship between embodied threat and threat suppression isn't that steep, meaning that the increases in embodied threat don't lead to as much threat suppression because people are more safe to express that threat suppression in their workplace versus people who are higher, or these discussions are more unsafe in their workplace. They engage in even heightened threat suppression. And so identity-based psychological safety is an important thing that we found in this paper that we're continuing to study and understand in our future research. So now we'll move on to a second research project. In this project, what we examined were the perceptions of racial minority leaders that advocate for racial justice in organizations. And if you remember the summer of 2020, you remember that we were all either at home or we were going out in the world wearing masks, but there was also a massive racial justice movement that occurred that summer where people were protesting for racial equity for both Black people and Asian people in society. And as this racial justice movement was occurring, there were a lot of calls for individuals to engage in allyship or everyday behaviors to combat racism in their lives. And most of the time, when we think about allies, we think of someone who isn't a member of the group. So you can think of men who are allies for women, or heterosexual people as being allies for for LGBTQ identified individuals. And so what that tends to mean is that when people talk about allies for racial justice, there tends to be a focus on white individuals in the world, in society, and in organizations being allies for members of racial minority groups. Yet, when we look at a lot of the programs that have been developed and initiatives that are really helping members of racial minority groups, a lot of these programs are actually created by members of those groups. So you can think of former President Obama's My Brother's Keeper program that was designed to help young Black men succeed in society and in the workplace. And you could think of Black Girls Who Code, which is an organization that was started by a Black woman engineer designed to tackle the underrepresentation of Black people in tech spaces. And so what we examined in this research paper is whether racial minority leaders can actually be perceived as effective allies for racial justice, given that they may be members of the group that they're advocating for. And the main takeaway from this work is that we find that same race allyship is actually particularly risky for racial minority leaders because people view them as engaging in high levels of in-group favoritism. And so what we do in this paper is we differentiate between same-race allyship or cross-race allyship behaviors that are directed at another racial group that one is not a part of. And we find that when leaders engage in same-race allyship, they are thought of as engaging in more in-group favoritism. And this has negative downstream consequences for those leaders. So I'll show you the results from a study that outlined this. So we conducted a study where we asked employees to just tell us about a time when their leader, who was a member of a racial minority group, engaged in either same race or cross race allyship. And what we found is that employees who remembered the time that their leader engaged in same race allyship actually rated this leader as engaging in more in-group favoritism than participants who were asked to recall a time where their leader engaged in cross-race allyship. We also found evidence that these perceptions of in-group favoritism then led people to believe that this leader was a less effective ally than when they engaged in cross-race allyship. But one of my favorite parts of this paper is that we actually identify a tool that leaders can use to combat the negative effects of same race allyship. And so, what we find in this, what we look at in this paper is whether voice amplification framing or amplifying the voice of lower level employees during one's allyship can actually reduce perceptions of in group favoritism. And so, we ran a study where participants were presented with a scenario where a leader was engaging in same race or cross race allyship. But then this leader actually said, I'm doing this in order to bring ideas that have been brought to my attention by other lower level employees. And I'm really just trying to use my leadership position to highlight these voices of these lower level employees. And what we found is that in the case of same race allyship, this voice amplification framing actually reduced perceptions of in group favoritism. And this was a really encouraging finding for us, given the fact that a lot of times when employees are engaging in DEI advocacy behaviors in the workplace, it tends to be done in conjunction with other employees. So just highlighting the fact that you have been engaging in these behaviors and coming up with these initiatives with others can help reduce these perceptions of in-group favoritism. And the last paper I'm going to talk to you about, the last study, is a more recent research that I'm doing. It hasn't been published. This is actually the first time I'm even talking about it in a more public setting, is this idea of racism-elusive language. And there are various instances in the workplace where leaders are actually needing to today reference race in their communication. So you can think of when a leader is talking about their DEI initiatives, they may be talking about different progress that is being made towards different DEI goals, and they may need to talk about employee race or racial equity when discussing these DEI initiatives. It could be that a leader decides to send out a mass communication to their organization in the wake of a mega threat. So, for example, we know that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, most Fortune 500 company CEOs sent out some communication to their employees in response to that event. And then addressing an internal race related event. There are lots of instances and things that happen in organizations that are race related when leaders need to actually address those events with their employees. But what we notice is that when leaders do this, they also often use vague terms and they avoid directly mentioning specific racial groups. So here's an example. There were a lot of statements that were released by university leaders in the wake of the Supreme Court decision that banned race-based admissions or race-conscious admissions to colleges in this country. And one university official statement said this, and in the statement, this university official talked about people and students that have a myriad of experiences and perspectives, and talked about the fact that this ruling created a new impediment to their ability to foster academic excellence. So instead of talking about the fact that race actually really impacts the experiences of students in the world, and that this ruling would prevent the university from being able to be as racially diverse as it was before, it instead was a new impediment to academic excellence. In another example, there was a recent incident at a college in the US where a student was accused of carving a racial slur into their teammate's chest. And the university official communicated out to the campus community about this event. And here's a piece of that communication. They said, this leader said they were profoundly distressed about what happened. So they didn't even specifically talk about the fact that there was a racial slur that was at the heart of this incident, and the impact that it has on those who have been underrepresented. So not the impact that it has had on Black students, but on those who are underrepresented. So in this paper, in this study, what we're doing is we're first starting with really categorizing language, and we use statements released by universities to categorize this language. And so you can think of a highly elusive phrase as something like, we care a lot about employees and students from all walks of life, where a less elusive statement would say something like, we care about Black and Latinx or racial minority employees and students. Leaders could say something like, we care about people with unique backgrounds and experiences, or they could directly talk about racism as being part of those experiences, negatively impacted by racism. And or you could refer to the system as a complex, multifaceted world, or you could talk about actual racial inequities and racism that continues to persist in the world. So we're running studies where we're having people be exposed to different statements that vary in their level of elusive language. And what we find is that most participants actually choose to select statements, if they were the ones who were going to send these statements out to employees, that avoid using the word racism and avoid naming specific racial groups. So this idea of people using elusive language when talking about race is very common, we're finding in our studies. There are some predictors that we're finding. So participant race, where white participants are more likely to use more elusive language than participants who are members of racial minority groups. But I think more importantly and more strongly, we're finding that people are worried about conflict or really offending people, though they tend to use more elusive language. And when people are against DEI efforts, they tend to prefer more elusive language as well. But one of the most interesting parts of this project is that we're finding that when people are giving their impressions on the statements that directly say the word racism actually aren't engendering as high backlash as people expect it to. So when a leader specifically calls out the fact that this racial slur was um, uh, was accused of being carved into someone's chest, and this is a racist incident that has no place in this organization, participants are not highly offended by those comments, but participants who are members of groups who are negatively impacted by these events do feel more supported and like it's more genuine when there are direct mentions of race. And so this is the ongoing research that I'm doing now that I'm really excited to continue to move forward. So, in closing, some key takeaways from today. So, racial minority employees have unique experiences in organizations. And what I do in my research is I try to uncover some of these experiences. So, whether that's experiencing heightened threat in the wake of mega threat events and looking at the ways in which, because employees have to suppress that threat, it leads to heightened avoidance on their work tasks, or it's racial minority leaders who face a precarious situation when they engage in same race allyship. And so using voice amplification framing can really highlight or reduce the negative consequences of this. And then finally, when leaders talk about race, they tend to use very elusive language that avoids directly talking about racism. But the concerns around offending people with their language might be more overblown than are really there. And this is research that I'm continuing to look into and dig into now. So with that, I will say thank you, and I will start taking your questions. So any questions you have, feel free to put them in the chat. Yes, so there was a question from Monica that asks the elements of a more or less safe workplace, and whether what are the elements of a more or less safe workplace, and were these defined by our participants. So our finding around identity-based psychological safety, the way that we analyze this data is we actually ask participants to just tell us whether they had felt comfortable talking about the mega threat event in their workplace, and to tell us why they had felt comfortable or why they didn't feel comfortable talking about it. And what we found is that in general, most employees rated that they didn't feel comfortable talking about it, and that it just felt like doing engaging in this type of these discussions was risky. And so both white employees and Black employees talked about the fact that having these discussions were risky. But an interesting thing that we also found is that for the employees that said that they did feel comfortable talking about these mega threat events in the workplace, it tended to be that they described one-on-one conversations that they were having with um, their coworkers, people that they worked directly with, and they talked about the fact that it tended to be short conversations that just acknowledge the fact that the event occurred, acknowledge the fact that these events are especially negative and tragic and really sad instances, and just talked about the fact that this is just another example of negative things that are happening in the world and the impact that had on the employee. But the thing that stood out to me about this data is that these conversations tended to only last about 5 minutes, and so they tended to be short interactions where employees were able to talk about the event that happened, offered support, and then continue to kind of do their work tasks. And that's interesting to me because most of the time when I talk to students or, practitioners about engaging in conversations about race, they think I'm telling them to go to a, courageous conversations meeting where there are ground rules set and we're doing trust falls and there's all this build up to having these conversations about race. But what we actually found is that there were these mini conversations that were occurring. So to get back to the question that was asked, I think one of the elements of a safe workplace is actually one where people are able to interpersonally connect and establish trust between each other that then goes beyond just trust in your work task, but also being able to talk about your race related experiences that in some instances will be taught negative and talking about racism and discrimination, et cetera. But in some instances may not. You may be talking about the things you do on the weekend and the church you go to, et cetera. But as these conversations become normal, I think that in workplaces, they can really cascade to create a safer environment. Okay, so there are lots more questions. So I'll take, please say people. So this is a good question. So Jasmine asks, when I talk about people who are worried about offending people, when I talk about concerns of backlash related to directly addressing race, the question is, am I talking about the concerns of offending a specific group, those that are impacted by the racial incident, or those that are more observers or a member of another group? So when we ask the questions about, we actually have asked this survey question in different ways. We have asked about whether you were worried or thinking about the perceptions of people who are members of the group when when selecting the communication for the event. And we've been talking about out-group members or people who are not members of the group who are observing this communication. And what we find is that people are concerned with both, actually, and so there's this desire to communicate that you care and understand and you empathize with a group that could be negatively impacted by this incident. But there's also a concern that by showing that empathy, you actually might be having people think that you don't care about others who are members of different groups. And so people are actually, there's this tension where they're trying to balance the two. And so in trying to balance the two, people tend to end up at a statement that says we care about employees with myriad of experiences and backgrounds. And the problem with that is that it doesn't communicate the genuine empathy that the person was wanting to communicate. And while it potentially doesn't offend or raise concerns from the out group that you were trying to appease or accommodate, that out group also is still looking at this communication and recognizing that you're not directly saying what you mean as well. And so that out group also has perceptions that this communication isn't very genuine. And so what we find is that people are wrestling with this tension, and in going in the middle, they're actually not helping either side in their communication. But it's still really early work. But it was a very good question that we've been investigating so far. So I think we have time for one more. Yeah, so there's a question from Lily that asks, in my research on the impact of megathreats on people at work, did I find that it was hard to entangle the impacts of one megathreat from another because it seems that these highly publicized racist incidents seem to overlap. And so this is a good question. So in this research, we do struggle with the fact that it seems that sometimes there are times where there's a discrete instance that impacts members of one group, but then at other times there seems to just be a rolling incidents that are capturing headlines all the time. And in more recent work, what I've been doing is looking at the effects that these events have, not just on individuals who are members of the group that was targeted or share identity with victims of the event, but also on individuals who are not members of that group, but they themselves still have a marginalized identity. And what I'm finding in that work is that the events also have impacts on people who are not members of the targeted group, but still are members of another marginalized identity group, particularly when the events mirror those that are directed at other groups. So, for example, if you think about a racially motivated shooting that captures headlines, it tends to target specifically one racial group, but these events or these racially motivated shootings in the past have been targeted at multiple different racial groups in the US. And so what I find is that when participants are exposed, even when they're not a member of the group, if you're a member of the group who has been targeted similarly in the past, it also has negative impacts on participants who are perceiving this event because it works to raise these cognitions about the experiences that your own group has had. So I do find that there are overlapping consequences or spillover consequences to multiple groups when these mega threat events occur. And these concerns are on top of the fact that most event observers still react negatively or experience sadness because of these events, because of the tragic nature of the events. So we are at 102, so I have to end it right here. But what I will do is later this afternoon, I'm going to go on LinkedIn and look at the comments, and I will actually respond to questions as I can later today. So thank you so much for joining us. Our next LinkedIn Live session will be next month on November 6th, where Professor Jeanette Song will be talking about sustainability in supply chain. So thank you for joining us, and come back next month. Thanks.